The Quest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.
Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to episode 2 of the spring-summer season 2025 of the Quest Podcast. For this episode, I'm really delighted to be joined by Declan Casey and Lauren Andersen of Irish Funds. And the topic of our conversation is the Savings and Investments Union. Now, the Savings and Investments Union is really a follow-on to the original Capital Markets Union project, which kicked off in the mid-2010s, and it really aimed to try and make the European capital markets more effective and efficient. And a lot of it was focused around getting those vast sums that are on deposit, earning no interest, out working in the European capital markets. So the podcast is quite timely because the European Commission is currently carrying out a targeted consultation on the integration of EU capital markets. And that consultation closes on the 10th of June. And the guys in Irish Funds are working hard at this moment in time on putting together the response for that consultation. I'll put a link to the consultation in the description for the podcast below in case you're interested. And in the meantime, let's get on with the podcast.
The Quest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.
Hello, Declan and Lauren. Thanks very much for coming on the podcast. Great to have you.
Thanks, Danny.
So today's topic is, well, it's the Savings and Investments Union, the European Union's, I guess, what feels like latest iteration from the Capital Markets Union. Do you remember the Capital Markets Union, Declan? Lauren is too young and fresh.
She is, Danny. I remember it well. It's about 2015. And I remember at the time it was Lord Hill was charged with delivering it. And again, with best made plans, we then had Brexit in between. That was a blow to CMU. But now I think we've moved on, and certainly the current environment, geopolitical, tariffs, wars have, I think, given a new impetus to capital markets and now the Savings and Investment Union. It certainly seems that, well, I think Europe always felt that the capital markets weren't as developed as, for example, the US and other regions. And over the years we've seen that play out in, I think, was it UCITS 3, where you had the mergers. They concluded that the optimal size of Europe was much smaller. Yeah. So there's always been this desire, I suppose, to create greater efficiencies and tap into European capital markets more. I think, though, over the last 8-9 years, there hasn't been the same imperative that we kind of...
Yeah, the wheel has been lacking a little bit, the actual...
I think there's more talk than action.
Yeah.
Perhaps. I suppose prior to the SIU, you had the retail investment strategy.
Yeah.
Again, which kind of seemed to ebb and flow. And I think, again, in Europe, it kind of sat everywhere and nowhere in the Commission, was kind of one of the sense I have. I think now, again, as I said, there seems to be, with a new Commission, first of all, I think a very clear realization of the need and the opportunity for European capital markets to help support the European economy. And again, that's on the back of the Draghi and the Letter reports, who very clearly identified a greater role for European capital markets. And again, so it's all kind of come together, I think.
I think, for me, the Capital Markets Union essentially was about trying to get some of that savers' money out of mattresses and into the capital markets, so that if there would be another credit crunch or banking crisis, that there was alternative source of funding for the European economy to try and build the roads and schools and everything else that we need, the hospitals and everything else that capital could do. But I guess it came at a time when we're still kind of post-crisis, and there's still a lot of post-crisis measures. And I think financial services was viewed as a problem to be fixed. And the momentum, I don't think, was there. But it does feel like that has shifted with the Draghi report and the current administration in the US and other things like that. It has shifted to...
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's always this risk and reward kind of trade-off. And I think we've spent probably 15 to 20 years regulating on the back of the global financial crisis.
Yeah.
I suppose one of my, I wouldn't call it fears, but I think if you do something for that length of time, that's your playbook. That's your default.
Yes.
And it's very hard to change it and kind of rebalance towards the opportunity side. But I do think, I do have a real sense now that there's more of that. The opportunities that exist are probably being talked about more. I think we're fortunate here as well in Ireland that, last year we had the Department of Finance's Funds Sector 2030 review.
Yeah.
And again, probably informed a bit by some of the early SIU initiatives or conversations in Europe, that when you talk about SIU now with kind of international policymakers, they talk about it from the top down and the bottom up. So the funds review obviously has positioned us quite well. We have 40 odd recommendations in there, and a lot of them are, you can see, are aligned with the Savings and Investment Union. And certainly when we talk to government and partners, we do kind of highlight the alignment of what legislative and regulatory changes we're looking for, with greater funding, the greater utilization of capital markets to fund the European economy and the domestic economy as well. It's kind of an untapped resource. Again, going back to the evolution, I think we've probably spent the last 10 years preparing for greater retail participation, cost, fees, charges, reporting. Again, when I talk about the balance of opportunity and risk, I think it was, well, we have to mitigate all the risk we can identify before we open up the opportunities. So I do think the industry is definitely in a much better place now to tap into greater retail participation.
Maybe the time has come. Maybe now is the right time that the mindsets have shifted, that FS has gone from being a problem to fix to something that can contribute to a solution to things like climate change and an aging population. And well, the world has shifted. We feel we need Europe to be able to do more for itself.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And even talking, and I suppose I have to be kind of mindful when I talk to people from the role I'm in. So a lot of it is capital markets and investment funds, but I do think in this new commission, it is certainly the real opportunity, I think, to support Europe's economic growth. And it's really interesting. We've met a number of foreign delegations and had conversations. Like SIU is still at a relatively early stage under this commission. And there's concepts as opposed to kind of hard details. But even things like tax incentives. In the past, if you've talked about pan-European tax incentives or even domestic tax incentives for investment funds, you'd be wasting your time. You'd say, that's almost impossible.
Yeah.
Whereas now, nobody is dismissing concepts like that. We've had some meaningful conversation with respect to if there was kind of pan-European tax incentives, well, then the quid pro quo would be a desire for that capital to be deployed in Europe. And again, what that means. And there's concepts like that are kind of, I suppose, aired as part of this SIU consultation.
Yeah.
That issued recently. We're in the midst of kind of formulating a view on, other concepts like an EU wrapper or an EU investment account to try and tap into, again, greater retail participation. I mean, look, our view is quite simple. That when these things arise, we say, well, that is a use of funds, surely.
Yeah, absolutely.
But again, it's just to see if there's another avenue to kind of open the greater retail participation, even if it's used, if it's a wrapper, if it's a wrapper that comes with a tax incentive, we're open to anything.
Yeah,
to try and bring greater capital into the sector.
So in terms of the detail then, Lauren, you're the expert. You're the one who knows ins and outs, albeit that I guess at this stage, as Declan mentioned, SIU is kind of concepts rather than serious detail. But talk us through a little bit of what's in there.
Yeah, well, the consultation is massive. So it's around 92 pages of questions. So interesting that the consultation doesn't actually have context to what the commission is looking at. So like Declan said, it's really early on and ideas are developing, but it touches a range of subjects. So there's 7 sections and there's 2 parts. So it is really broken down into these subsections: trading, post-trading, but there's also an asset management and fund section specifically, a supervision section, etc. And it really looks at everything you can imagine. There's we have our ETF group looking at certain sections. We have eligible assets is touched upon, supervision more broadly. So it is a really big kind of swath across the entire industry to see where SIU can grow. And it's interesting. It kind of looks at opportunities and potential barriers. So it does pose challenges, around trading, post-trading infrastructure, distribution, effective cross-border operations. There's so much within it and a lot to consider. And it is in a very tight 8-week timeline, which is making probably the most challenging part for industries. The SIU is a massive project to take on, and it is in a really short amount of time. And there is a lot of consideration around supervision and that EU central supervision, which is really interesting and something we're only just diving into as a concept and trying to talk to industry about, because that's something that we've not really considered in depth before.
Yeah, it's something that exists, but only there's central supervision. Let's say if you take ESMA, only in relation to a small number of areas. So the idea that I guess it's worth the conversation, and part of that conversation is how much of an issue is not having a single supervisory authority, as opposed to how much of an issue is the barriers to trade or the high expectations and the high regulatory burden.
Yeah. And
would a single supervisor necessarily mean that burden is reduced, or is it just going to remain as high? So it's not.
Yeah, again, Danny, I think it was 2018 or 19, there was proposals, concrete proposals that came from the Commission with respect to the reform of the ESAs, which set out at the time, proposed new roles for ESMA in particular. Now, never really got off the ground. It was met with considerable opposition. So we're fortunate in that some of our thinking has been done, and we just need to validate and refresh it to see if the issues and concerns, for example, that we had with those proposals would still remain, or whether the pendulum has swung a bit. I would say our kind of sense at the moment with respect to the single supervision is that there's probably more immediate progress can be made without kind of jumping into restructuring the governance of ESMA. For example, again, this cross-border distribution and the additional kind of country supplements and little bits of information that each member state might add on if you wanted to. What's well known, the local marketing requirements has always frustrated a real pan-European single market product. We met the Commission earlier in the year, and we said these are all known. We have a list of these kind of different things, and it's not that any one of them is overly burdensome, but each one kind of adds a nuance, and then the distributors and the managers have to do kind of an annual assessment that they're complying with the local marketing requirements. So that's an unnecessary cost where you have a single market. So I suppose our view with respect to, again, with single supervisions, well, these are known barriers that could be easily addressed before getting into the weeds on we need a different ESMA or a single supervisor.
Yeah, I guess when you work through 92 pages of questions, there are action items that could be attended to that will maybe give you more bang for your buck, right? Stuff you could do more quickly that would be more effective. Revisiting ESAs could be done, obviously, but it's quite a big task and, going to require lead-in time depending on what it would lead to. So I guess there may be other ways other actions that could be more quickly taken to give more effective results.
Yeah. And in fairness, as Lauren said, questions are very open-ended. So in fairness, you can understand the Commission don't want to rule out anything. There's, again, in the context of single supervision, there's colleges of supervisors, things like that have been mooted, and something we'll explore as we kind of develop our response.
Yeah. And I guess you're engaging with industry now to kind of elicit feedback and assistance with preparing the response. Are we at a stage where you have a sense for, are there kind of those questions, areas that industry is kind of corralling around as being ones that merit more attention, or?
I think it really depends on the cohort you're talking to, right?
Okay.
So you're going to have certain cohorts. There's depositories, passport being considered, right? So then you have, the depository cohort very interested in that. You're going to have distribution, very interested in some of those distribution questions. We're kind of linked in with the FAMA, and depending on which standing committee, you're seeing different interest at different levels for, different countries. So it really ranges. Obviously, I think the supervision questions are really interesting. And to Declan's point, there's a lot of opportunities to call out great ways to improve supervisory practices, like not necessarily challenges, but better use of the CSAs, right? So we have examples of how CSAs have been really successful and really interesting, or opportunities to call out duplications where there could be streamlining. There's a lot of discussion within the consultation kind of bedded into the questions around that simplification objective, which is really interesting. So how do you simplify? How do you streamline? And there's a lot of that, even talking about Prips Kid and things like that, where you can streamline some of these really burdensome obligations, challenges that you're seeing with the omnibus package. So, there was the omnibus that came out, which was the first draft of that simplification agenda. And you do see that streamed throughout. And a lot of industry is interested in that, reducing the cost of some of that duplicatory, so Declan's nodding his head because I think he's hearing the exact same thing from everybody is how do we streamline it? How do we make it more cost effective, less burdensome? Some of that is within here, which can be really useful. And I think that's getting a lot of interest from firms because the commission is asking the right questions around some of that.
Yeah, there is probably nothing that gladdens the industry heart more than the word simplification and that theme working its way through. And I don't want to spend too long on it because I'm going to do another episode in this season on simplification. But it's my experience, I'm sure it's yours the same, that it is something people are latching onto and saying, well, is it possible to be pretty much as effective as we are at the moment in terms of being regulated and protecting consumers and safeguarding stability, but in a way that is simpler and less costly to do and achieve more or less the same thing?
And I think one of the challenges with the simplification that you see in the omnibus already is when you simplify certain things, there can be downstream impacts, right? So if you simplify reporting, you don't have the data, right? We're seeing that with the omnibus. So the commission seems to be careful to ask, and what do you think the implications are going to be? And we're really trying to, in some ways, do that math 10 steps ahead because we don't actually know what the implications are going to be. And there's not a lot of information here. So you're trying to understand what some of that will be downstream. And that's a challenge, especially within 8 weeks.
Yeah. Well, again, it's competing objectives. I mean, the Commission were very clear in publishing their omnibus proposal. They wanted to cut down the reporting obligation on European SMEs by, 20-30% through CSDR. And the other side of that is the asset managers, and as investors, rely on that data to meet their SFDR obligations.
Yeah.
So how do you bridge that gap? I think again an interesting comment that came up recently about simplification and harmonized approaches. Well, if you simplify and take away some of the detail in pan-European regulation, does that encourage divergent practices? So there's a tension there between but I suppose a pan-European environment.
I guess you can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
Right.
No, sorry, I agree with you, Danny, but isn't that the challenge? Where's the trade-off?
Yeah.
Simplification and convergence. But look, again, they're good questions. We're going to kind of try to share our thoughts on them as we prepare our response. And we'll see how it evolves. It's early days, and it's only when you start engaging with details on what this might look like, you'll really get a sense of what the opportunities and the trends are.
And I know when the consultation is presented as a series of questions without very much context, it's hard to just decipher from it where does my attention need to go, or more importantly, where is the Commission's real attention and what are the important points versus the rest. But
sometimes it's the broader picture too, right? It's such a big consultation. Sometimes they ask the question and it's easy to gripe over things that have frustrated you, right? But it's a bigger picture. The SIU isn't, some challenge you had 6 months ago or 6 years ago. And it's trying to zoom out and make sure to focus on that. And that can be really challenging. And particularly when you're sitting at the AFAMA table, because then you've got everybody's got issues and everything, and to get that zoom in.
I'll give you a tip. Having the other side of that table and reading consultation responses, a whinge is no good, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing goes down worse than a whinge, so it does need to be measured, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's so important to engage at this stage because this is when the page is a little bit more blank, and you do get the opportunity to shape and say, listen, action here is going to be more effective than here.
I mean, in fairness, Lauren's done up a very detailed project plan to get us to kind of our final response. And that's one of the key challenges. We realized that this is essentially a strategic consultation as opposed to an operational consultation. And while one will feed the other, I think where we're at the moment is the strategic vision. And that's where she's built in kind of a strategic review of our answers, make sure it's consistency, it's joined together in finalising our response.
And I guess the fact that it has grown out of something previously that you've put brain power and thought into, the CMU allows you to come up with your strategic plan, your perspective on it, because you're not starting entirely from scratch.
No, it's true. Although the world is different now, you know, globalization, you know, whatever, 5-10 years ago, the positions, again, were driven by kind of what we're seeing there. Then it's not to say they've changed, but I do think we need to validate them. I things like depository passport and things like that. I don't think our views are as strong as they would have been. No, I don't think they've changed, but they're not as strong as they would have been 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
So look, the groundwork is there, and it's just so that's positive. But we don't want to, you know, again, we don't want to we don't want to base our response on what we know. It's the visionary piece is as important in my mind.
Yeah. And so then in terms of a deadline for the response, when are you going to be coming up from air after all this?
The 10th of June. So there's, you know, we have our conference right in the middle of that, which makes it quite busy. So we'll have the first draft by the end of this week. And then, you know, that is going to be the penultimate draft because it's such a short timeline. And interestingly enough, actually, when you look at the consultation, it doesn't look that bad because it's 1 to 5 scales or yes or no, but every question has at least 3 sub-questions and every sub-question has a text box. So I would say if anybody's thinking of picking up this consultation, it is much bigger and meatier than you would ever realize with all the sub-questions and the sub-selection and trying to justify your 1 to 5 scale. So I picked it up thinking I was just going to select 1 to 5 and kind of run away with a great consultation and came out with, like Declan said, quite a detailed Excel plan.
Yeah,
never that easy.
No.
And even in fairness, in talking to members, they're going to focus on key aspects of it today.
Yeah, so you have stakeholders and members of the organization that will do their own responses that probably feed into your response.
Yeah.
And then as you engage with your peers in other jurisdictions and I guess stakeholders elsewhere, have you a sense for how it's being received more broadly than just in Ireland? How are our European friends looking at this?
Yeah, I've been sitting at the IFAMA groups kind of early stages, everyone assessing it, and it is just, first of all, wow, this is really big. A lot of it is that strategic thought of, okay, we see in some ways the direction of travel or the considerations of the questions. I guess it is generally surprisingly aligned at IFAMA. Like a lot of the countries in the IFAMA groups are not necessarily diverging from the original IFAMA position. So we would be largely aligned on those. But could always be a last minute change. So I think as things kind of develop and positions solidify, it could change. But early days, I think generally we're quite consistent with a lot of the other countries.
Well, again, I think given the open-ended nature of the questions, FAMA can come to kind of generic common reviews and avoid divergency at this stage.
Yeah.
The devil is often in the detail, Danny. And again, going back to what are others doing, the number of members that reached out to us very early saying, "How are we doing a response?" I need to believe that they'd like to see our thoughts to help inform their own response.
Yeah, and it is once you get down to those more individual responses from individual, either, I guess, professional services firms, particularly regulated firms, that's where you can start to see my 5 is your 1, or you know, and the numbers start to diverge a little bit.
I would say this Friday will be interesting when we get a lot of our responses in to see how the 1s and the 5s shake out in the commentary. But even one of the challenges is, you know, you have digital assets, depository, investment firms, distribution. They are all looking at things differently, and to then zoom out to that strategic view and also have that detail, it's quite challenging, right? You know, you've got these big questions, but also, you know, how are we going to do this very niche thing that's only investment firms are really, really invested in? So it's an interesting project in that way of how do you make it strategic, but also applicable to those stakeholders.
And so what's next then? So the response goes in 10th of June. This disappears and we never hear about it. We're doing the podcast in 15 years' time. And
no. Well, as you know, Danny, it wouldn't be unreasonable to think the Commission have a fair idea of what the next publication of a policy proposal would be, and this probably they were looking for it to validate that and inform that. We do, and as is evident from the omnibus proposal that came out, the very clear sense is this new Commission will be driven from the top down as opposed to the bottom up. So I do think really get a sense that they want to do something and want to achieve something. And again,
I also get the sense that they when they receive their advice from other European institutions and ESAs, if it's not pulling in the right direction that they have in mind, they're not necessarily going to just couch out of it, that they will say go again, or they'll do their own thing.
Well, already, I mean, we'll see on Esmond's advice to the Commission on LTIP Level 2 measures. The Commission went back to have another go at that.
Yeah.
So with SFDR, they had level 2. They haven't seen those passed.
I think, it's interesting. And I think you like to see all the EU institutions pulling the same direction. But they have different mandates.
They do, and maybe it's going to take a little time for them all to return to being on the same page. And
it is now, again, and this is why I thought if the omnibus is something to go by, we think kind of policy could move quite quickly in Europe. What will be interesting, and again, it's come up in some kind of recent conversations. Well, MEPs aren't necessarily subject matter experts. Even Econ, big important committee that has as much authority now as the council and the working and the members. And what if they come at it from a completely different perspective? Now, you would hope the institutions will have their ducks aligned, but that's an unknown. It wouldn't have, it will have frustrated the progress of initiatives in the past, but that's democracy at work.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the concepts on single supervisor is to be less democratic potentially, but more effective.
Yeah.
I have to say, I do. I always have, personally, I struggle with any dilution of democracy.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting how this serves as a bellwether for the state of the nation, the union, and how it's thinking more broadly across.
Yeah, no,
everything.
absolutely. Now, again, the other side to that, I've had several conversations with senior representatives from other member states who would say, well, look, if you look at capital markets, there's only about half a dozen European jurisdictions that really understand, have experience, and have sizable investment funds, asset management sectors. So why should 27 of them to get to debate it? Again, sorry, that's a bit of black and white. It never is.
Yeah.
But that's where they're coming from. Like, should we empower and embolden ESMA to be led by those half a dozen or so, as opposed to be held back by the other 20 odd?
Well, yeah, let's see, because I know if
absolutely.
you participate at European level, you will find fairly active contributions, and IOSCO the same, from fellow regulators who may not necessarily be from jurisdictions that have enormous asset management industries, but still have a view and still often bring very good thinking to the process.
No.
So
don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating for a single supervisor delusion, but no, you're right. And end of the day, you'd be tapping into their citizens.
yes, absolutely.
So that's important, and that's why, as I say, I think the democratic debate is important.
Yeah.
Interestingly on that though, there is a trend that these are a bit shorter, these consultations, and much more escalated. So, like having this at an 8-week, there's an SFDR consultation, a call for evidence, it's a month, right? So these kind of quicker escalated for these really, important regulatory topics. To Declan's point about it being less democratic, you're not given the opportunity and the time to really dive into these topics for those who are being mostly impacted by it and the SMEs. So it's just an interesting on that. I've started to notice now. I wasn't here for the original CMU, but since I've joined, even those have cut down on time and the questions have gotten bigger and almost more important.
Good job, you've done better to do that.
Yeah.
Sit up and write 8-week consultation responses on enormous pieces of work.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing either, because sometimes you can see how you cut down rabbit holes and
Absolutely,
you have to kind of bottom out every proposal. Again, one of the concepts that have been out there and mooted back and forth for a number of years is kind of directive versus regulation and detail, prescription versus less prescription. You know yourself, Danny, that everything that's on a page needs to be discussed, agreed, and debate and agreed. So again, as I say, it'll be interesting to see the sense that this is kind of a bit of a new world, and we'll see how they navigate it. But I think there is a sense that we will see quicker policy. Well, sorry, my sense is that they want to see quicker policy formation.
My sense is there'll be another Quest podcast episode with you two guys on it in the fairly near future, when we see the output of this and the thinking, as much as it's not evolved yet, it will have done by the time we next see that.
Yeah.
Or at least they will show their hand a little bit more.
Well, there's big concepts.
So
Yeah.
Single supervisor tax incentive, and then the
Mhm.
ISA, UK ISAs, things like that, directed investment, fairly significant sea changes.
Yeah.
But again, I think certainly certainly in my last 10, 15 years, I haven't seen such enthusiasm might be an overstatement, but drive, I suppose, to deliver, albeit a relatively early days at the moment.
right. I'm going to take that as a positive, Declan. I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for coming on the Quest podcast. Really appreciate your insights. Very interesting and very important piece of work going on here. Definitely one we're going to see more development on in the nearer future, I suspect. So thanks again for coming on the Quest podcast. Thank you very much for listening. We'll catch you in the next episode of the Quest podcast.
The Quest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.